Poor woman married a disabled man for love, later shocked to discover he was a secret millionaire baron. My beautiful family, today's story is a true masterpiece of love, sacrifice, and destiny. Please don't skip even a single moment because the ending will touch your soul and leave you deeply satisfied. Watch with an open heart, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. I promise this story will stay with you. Hi, my most powerful, loyal, and great family, how are you? Welcome back to Mr. Peter's Stories. I will take only your precious 2 minutes, and I want to ask you something. Why you don't trust your Mr. Peter? In which story did a woman ever lose in the end? Never, my family. Because in my stories, the woman always rises, always wins, always shines with her powerful victory. Women are not weak. Women are stronger than men. History itself proves it. Look at Harriet Tubman, a black woman who escaped slavery and went back again and again to free others. Look at Sojourner Truth, who stood before the world and said, "Ain't I a woman?" shaking the ground beneath her feet. Look at Rosa Parks, who with one act of courage refused to move and started a movement that changed history. Look at Maya Angelou, who turned her pain into poetry that lifted generations. These are not just women, my family. These are warriors. That is why in my stories, no matter the tears, no matter the storms, the woman never loses. She always comes out stronger, more powerful, and more victorious, because the strength of a woman is the strength of the world. If your heart is true, write present. If your love is real, write I am with Mr. Peter. Let me see my family shining in unity. Some men enter your life like thunder, sudden, powerful, and impossible to ignore. The morning rush at Café Luna hit like a tidal wave at exactly 7:47 a.m., and Stephanie Catley was drowning in orders. Steam hissed from the espresso machine while the register's digital display flickered ominously, a sure sign it would crash before noon. Again. She tucked a rebellious curl behind her ear, her dark skin glistening with perspiration as she juggled 3 orders simultaneously, her movements precise despite the chaos. "Double-shot oat milk latte, no foam," she called out, sliding the cup across the worn wooden counter. The businessman didn't even look up from his phone as he grabbed it and rushed toward the door, leaving exact change but no tip. Story of her life. That's when he walked in. The morning crowd parted unconsciously around him, not because he demanded space, but because he moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to navigate the world differently. The elegant silver-topped cane caught the light as he approached her counter, each step measured and purposeful. His clothes were simple, dark jeans, a charcoal sweater that had seen better days, but something about the way he carried himself suggested depths beneath the surface. Stephanie felt her breathing slow for the first time that morning. "Good morning," he said, and his voice was warm honey over gravel, tinged with an accent she couldn't quite place. British, maybe, but softened by years elsewhere. "Could I have a large coffee, black?" She studied his face as she reached for a cup. Strong jawline, cheekbones that could cut glass, but it was his eyes that stopped her cold, storm grey and haunted, as if they'd seen too much of the world's ugliness. There was something almost familiar about him, though she was certain they'd never met. Sure thing. She poured the coffee, inhaling the rich aroma that always reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen. "You're new to the neighborhood?" A smile ghosted across his lips, transforming his entire face. "In a way. I'm staying nearby for a while." He reached for his wallet, then paused, studying the overflowing tip jar beside the register. "Actually, would you mind if I paid for the gentleman behind me as well? He looks like he's having the kind of morning that could use some kindness." Stephanie glanced back to see an elderly man in paint-splattered clothes, counting coins with shaking hands, clearly trying to determine if he had enough for even a small coffee. "That's incredibly generous," she said, genuinely moved by the gesture. "Most people don't even notice when someone's struggling." "I've learned that noticing is usually the first step toward helping." He handed her a $20 bill. "Keep the change for others who might need it." The gesture was so quietly generous, so completely without fanfare, that Stephanie felt her heart do something strange in her chest. In 3 years of running this cafe, she'd encountered plenty of show-off philanthropy, people who made grand gestures to be seen and praised. But this was different, genuine compassion offered without expectation of recognition. "I'm Matthew Gray, by the way," he said quietly as she processed the payment. "Stephanie Catley." She extended her hand, and when his fingers closed around hers, she felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the faulty wiring in the old building. His hands were strong but gentle, with calluses that spoke of more than a life of leisure. "And thank you for that kindness. People like Mr. Chen." She nodded toward the elderly man, now smiling with relief. "They make this neighborhood special." "So do people like you," Matthew said, his storm-gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse race. "I can tell just by watching you work that you care about everyone who walks through that door." The words slipped out before she could stop them, bold and forward in a way that would have mortified her grandmother. But Matthew's smile widened, reaching his eyes for the first time. "You definitely will," he promised. He lingered a moment longer, seeming reluctant to leave, before the pressure of the waiting line finally forced him toward the door. Stephanie watched him go, noting the slight hitch in his step, the way he favored his right leg. But there was no self-pity in his bearing, just quiet dignity. Earth to Stephanie. Her part-time employee, Rosa, materialized beside her with raised eyebrows. "Girl, you're glowing. Don't be ridiculous." But Stephanie could feel the heat in her cheeks as she turned back to the next customer. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of orders and small talk, but her mind kept drifting to storm-gray eyes and the way Matthew had looked at her, like she was precious. When had anyone last looked at her that way? At exactly 11:30, the register finally gave up its electronic ghost, freezing mid-transaction with a customer's credit card trapped in the reader. Stephanie groaned, recognizing the signs of an expensive repair job she couldn't afford. "I'm so sorry," she told the frustrated businessman whose card was now held hostage. "The machine does this sometimes. Let me try to forget it." He stalked out, leaving his half-finished order behind. Stephanie slumped against the counter, calculating how much this breakdown would cost her, money she didn't have, couldn't spare. The cafe barely broke even on good months, and this definitely wasn't shaping up to be a good month. That's when she noticed another $20 bill tucked discreetly under the sugar dispenser, along with a note written in elegant script. "Saw your register trouble. Hope this helps with repairs. Thank you for the warmth you bring to this neighborhood. M.G." Her heart started racing as she unfolded the note. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of him at the crosswalk, his distinctive silhouette unmistakable even in the crowd. As if sensing her gaze, he turned back toward the cafe. Their eyes met through the glass, and he touched his temple in a small salute before disappearing around the corner. Stephanie clutched the $20 bill, her heart hammering against her ribs. $40 total for a $3 cup of coffee and a stranger's kindness. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the gesture, the quiet generosity, the fact that he'd noticed her struggling and helped without making her feel like a charity case. Who was that? Rosa appeared at her elbow, following her gaze toward the now empty crosswalk. "I'm not sure," Stephanie admitted. And it was true. Matthew Gray was a mystery wrapped in worn denim and quiet dignity, but something told her he was going to matter a lot. She tucked the bill into her apron pocket, right next to her heart, and tried to ignore the voice in her head, whispering that men like Matthew Gray, Men who moved with that kind of unconscious elegance, who spoke with that refined accent, didn't usually end up in cafes like hers. There was a story there, layers beneath the surface that she found herself desperate to uncover. Outside, the first drops of an unexpected rain began to fall, and Stephanie found herself smiling as she wiped down the counter. Something told her this was just the beginning. Some storms, after all, brought exactly what you needed. Chapter 2. Secrets and Storms. The most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves about the people we're falling for. 3 weeks later, Stephanie's heart still did that ridiculous flutter every time the brass bell above her door chimed at 8:15 a.m. sharp. Matthew Gray had become as regular as sunrise, appearing each morning with that same quiet smile and ordering the same large black coffee. But unlike the other regulars who barely acknowledged her existence, Matthew lingered. He asked about her day, remembered details she mentioned in passing, and somehow made her feel like the most fascinating person in the room. This morning was different, though. She could see it in the tension around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed against the counter as she prepared his coffee. "Rough night?" she asked, sliding the cup toward him. Matthew's laugh held no humor. "You could say that. I've been wrestling with some numbers that refuse to cooperate." He rubbed his temples, and Stephanie noticed the expensive-looking watch on his wrist, the first sign of real wealth she'd glimpsed beneath his carefully casual exterior. "What kind of numbers?" She leaned against the counter, genuinely curious. "I'm pretty good with math, if you need a fresh pair of eyes." Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe, or calculation. Financial projections mostly, nothing too exciting. He took a sip of his coffee, watching her over the rim. "What about you? How's business?" The question hit closer to home than he could know. Stephanie's stomach clenched as she thought about the stack of overdue notices hidden in her desk drawer, the loan payment she'd have to figure out by next Friday, the way she'd been rationing her own meals to keep the cafe stocked. "Could be better," she admitted, trying to keep her tone light. "The register repair set me back more than expected, and I'm behind on some payments." Matthew set down his cup with deliberate care. "What kind of payments?" "Business loan mostly. Equipment financing." She shrugged, embarrassed to be discussing her failures with this man who seemed to glide through life with such confidence. "Nothing I can't handle." But Matthew was studying her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "When do the payments need to be made?" "Friday." The word slipped out before she could stop it. "But really, I'll figure something out. I always do." Something shifted in Matthew's expression, a hardening around his eyes that reminded her he might not be as simple as he seemed. "What if I helped you look at the numbers? Sometimes a different perspective can reveal solutions that aren't immediately obvious." Stephanie blinked. "You'd do that?" "Of course." His voice was gentle now, the businesslike edge softening. "I'm quite good with financial planning, actually. It's what I do for work." The vague answer should have raised red flags, but Stephanie was too grateful and too desperate to question it. "That would be amazing. But I couldn't ask you to spend your evening." "You're not asking, I'm offering." Matthew reached across the counter and covered her hand with his, sending electricity shooting up her arm. "What time do you close?" 6, she managed, trying to ignore the way her pulse had kicked into overdrive at his touch. "Perfect. I'll bring dinner, and we'll tackle those numbers together." As if summoned by their conversation, the lunch crowd began filtering in, breaking the intimate bubble around them. Matthew released her hand reluctantly, picking up his coffee. "Until tonight, then," he said, and the promise in his voice made her knees weak. The rest of the day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Stephanie found herself checking the clock every few minutes, her mind spinning with equal parts anticipation and anxiety. What was she doing? letting a virtual stranger examine her finances. But something about Matthew felt safe, trustworthy in a way that defied logic. By 5:45, she'd sent Rosa home early, cleaned every surface twice, and changed into the one decent blouse she kept in the back office for emergencies. She was adjusting the lighting when the bell chimed, and Matthew stepped through the door carrying bags from Antonio's, the upscale Italian place 3 blocks over. "I hope you like fettuccine Alfredo," he said, setting the bags on the counter. I took a guess. Stephanie's mouth watered at the rich aroma wafting from the containers. "I love it, but you didn't have to go to such expense." "It's my pleasure." Matthew was already moving toward her usual table by the window, and something about his easy confidence made her wonder if expensive dinners were nothing to him. "Shall we eat first, or would you prefer to dive straight into the numbers?" "Food first," she decided, suddenly ravenous. "I haven't eaten since breakfast." Matthew paused in unpacking the containers, a frown creasing his brow. "That's not healthy, Stephanie." The concern in his voice caught her off guard. When was the last time anyone had worried about her eating habits? "I get busy and forget," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Occupational hazard of running your own place." "Still." Matthew served generous portions onto the plates he'd somehow procured, his movements practiced and elegant. "You need to take better care of yourself." The food was incredible, better than anything she could afford on her own, and Matthew proved to be excellent company. He asked thoughtful questions about her background, her dreams for the cafe, her family. She found herself telling him about her grandmother who'd taught her to bake, her parents' struggles as immigrants, her determination to build something lasting in this community. "What about you?" she asked as they finished eating. "Tell me about your family." Something shuttered in Matthew's expression. "Not much to tell. I'm somewhat estranged from them at the moment." The pain in his voice made her reach for his hand instinctively. "I'm sorry. That must be difficult." "It is." His fingers intertwined with hers, and she felt the calluses she'd noticed before, rough patches that spoke of physical work. "They have very specific expectations about how I should live my life, who I should spend time with. We've disagreed recently about those expectations." There was more to the story, much more, but Stephanie didn't push. She recognized the careful way he'd worded his answer, the way he'd deflected without quite lying. "Well," she said softly, "their loss is my gain." Matthew's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. "I was thinking the same thing about their opinion of you." Heat flooded her cheeks. "You told them about me?" "Not specifically." Matthew's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, sending shivers down her spine. "But they know I've been happier lately, more myself than I've been in years." The confession hung between them, charged with possibility. Stephanie felt herself leaning forward, drawn by the intensity in his storm-grey eyes, the way his gaze dropped to her lips. "Stephanie," he whispered, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. Then his phone buzzing against the table shattered the moment. Matthew glanced at the screen, and his face went carefully blank. "I'm sorry, I need to take this." He stood walking toward the window as he answered. "Edmund." "What's happened now?" Stephanie couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the tension in Matthew's shoulders, the way his free hand clenched into a fist. When he returned to the table, the spell was broken. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Fine." But his smile was forced now, and she could sense him pulling away. "Shall we look at those numbers?" The next 2 hours passed in a blur of spreadsheets and calculations. Matthew was brilliant with finances, spotting inefficiencies she'd missed and suggesting cost-cutting measures that could actually work. More importantly, he helped her see that the cafe's situation, while challenging, wasn't hopeless. "If you implement these changes," he said, pointing to his neat handwriting in the margins of her ledger, "and maybe consider adding some evening programming, poetry nights, acoustic music, you could increase revenue by 20% within 3 months. Stephanie stared at the numbers, hardly daring to hope. "You really think this could work?" "I know it could work." Matthew's voice was certain, authoritative in a way that made her wonder again about his mysterious background. "You have something special here, Stephanie. You just need to let people see it." When she looked up, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was desire there, yes, but also something deeper, something that looked almost like reverence. "Matthew," she started, but he was already standing, gathering his papers. "It's getting late," he said, though his eyes never left her face. "You should get some rest." He helped her clean up, their movements synchronized like they'd done this dance 100 times before. At the door, he paused, his hand on the brass handle. "Stephanie," he said softly, "thank you. For tonight, for everything." Before she could respond, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, gentle and sweet and far too brief. When he pulled away, his eyes were dark with longing. "Good night," he whispered, and then he was gone, leaving her standing in the doorway with her heart racing and her lips tingling from his kiss. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, and Stephanie touched her fingers to her mouth, wondering what secrets Matthew Gray was hiding and whether she was brave enough to uncover them. Chapter 3. The Ryan Ultimatum. Power without conscience is the most dangerous weapon in any family's arsenal. The marble floors of Ryanmore Estate echoed with the sharp click of Lady Cordelia Ryan's Louboutin heels as she paced the length of the morning room, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping a manila folder like it contained nuclear secrets. Her stepson's daily disappearances had finally been explained, and the revelation was far worse than she'd imagined. "Tell me again," she commanded Marcus Chen, the head of Matthew's security detail, who stood at military attention despite his obvious discomfort. "Every detail." "Lord Matthew has been visiting Café Luna in the Arts District daily for 3 weeks, Marcus recited, his voice carefully neutral. "He arrives at 8:15 a.m. and stays for approximately 15 minutes. Yesterday evening he remained until after 8 p.m., sharing dinner with the owner, Miss Stephanie Catley." Cordelia's laugh was ice-cold. "Stephanie Catley. And what do we know about this person?" 25 years old, African-American, owns the cafe outright but is struggling financially, no criminal record, bachelor's degree in business from City College, parents immigrated from Jamaica in the early 2000s. Marcus's recitation was clinical, professional, and damning in its very completeness. A black cafe owner. The words dripped from Cordelia's lips like poison. How absolutely perfect. The morning room's French doors burst open, and Octavius Ryan strode in, his face flushed with righteous indignation. At 26, Matthew's half-brother had inherited his father's sharp features, but none of his intelligence, making up for the deficit with pure venom. "Mother, please tell me this report is some kind of joke," Octavius snarled, snatching the folder from Cordelia's hands. "Matthew can't possibly be slumming with some ghetto coffee girl." "Lower your voice," Cordelia hissed, though her own disgust was equally palpable. "The staff doesn't need to hear about this embarrassment." Octavius flipped through the surveillance photos, his lip curling with each image. Matthew entering the cafe, Matthew sitting across from Stephanie, their heads bent close over papers. Matthew kissing Stephanie goodbye at the cafe's entrance. "This is what he's been doing while we've been trying to save the family reputation." Octavius threw the folder onto the antique writing desk. "Playing house with some welfare queen?" "Enough." Cordelia's voice cut through the air like a blade. "What matters now is ending this dalliance before it becomes public knowledge. Can you imagine what the society papers would do with this information? Baron Matthew Ryan, heir to the Ryan Moore fortune, cavorting with a common cafe owner. The scandal would destroy everything we've worked to rebuild after that unfortunate incident with his former fiancée. Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. Ma'am, if I may, Lord Matthew seems quite invested in this relationship. He's never stayed anywhere this long since returning from his European sojourn. Invested. Cordelia repeated the word like it left a bad taste in her mouth. My stepson is having some sort of psychological breakdown, obviously triggered by the stress of Vivian's betrayal last year. This is clearly a rebellion against his proper social position. Or maybe he's finally showing his true colors, Octavius added nastily. Father always said there was something wrong with Matthew, all that reading, all that talk about social responsibility. Maybe he belongs with these people. The cruelty in Octavius's voice made even Marcus flinch, but Cordelia merely smiled, an expression that held all the warmth of a cobra. Regardless of Matthew's motivations, this situation ends today. Marcus, I want you to arrange a meeting. Discreetly, of course. We'll handle this like civilized people. What if he refuses? Marcus asked. He won't, Cordelia said with absolute certainty. Because if he doesn't end this liaison voluntarily, I'll make sure Miss Catley's little cafe faces every code violation, health inspection, and tax audit the city can provide. I have friends in many departments, and they owe me favors. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. 3 hours later, Matthew sat in the back seat of his Range Rover, watching the familiar streets blur past through tinted windows. He'd been summoned home with the kind of formal request that wasn't really a request at all, and his stomach churned with the certainty that his carefully constructed peace was about to be shattered. Edmund Hartwell, his driver, and the closest thing Matthew had to a father figure, caught his eye in the rear-view mirror. Everything all right, my lord? Not really, Matthew admitted. Edmund was one of the few people who knew about his visits to Café Luna, though he'd been discreet enough not to comment on his employer's improved mood over the past weeks. I think my family has discovered my secret. Ah. Edmund's weathered face creased with concern. Miss Stephanie. Miss Stephanie. Matthew closed his eyes, remembering the way she'd felt in his arms last night, the trust in her dark eyes as she'd shown him her financial troubles. If they've hurt her in any way, they wouldn't dare, Edmund said firmly, but they'll try to hurt you through her. You know that, don't you? Matthew did know. He'd been naive to think he could keep his two worlds separate forever. Naive to believe that his family's reach wouldn't eventually extend to everything he touched. The only question now was how much damage they'd be willing to inflict to get their way. Ryan Moore Estate rose before them like a monument to old money and older prejudices, its limestone facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. Matthew's grandfather had built this place as a symbol of the family's arrival in American high society, but to Matthew, it had always felt more like a beautiful prison. Cordelia and Octavius were waiting in the formal drawing room, arranged like generals preparing for war. Marcus stood at attention by the windows, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious distress in his eyes. Matthew, darling, Cordelia purred, rising to kiss his cheek with the kind of calculated affection that had always made his skin crawl. So good of you to join us. We have some rather pressing matters to discuss. I'm sure you do. Matthew settled into his grandfather's leather chair, the same seat where he'd learned about duty and responsibility and the weight of family expectations. Should I assume this concerns my recent activities? Your recent embarrassments, you mean? Octavius couldn't contain himself, practically vibrating with malicious energy. Really, Matthew? A black cafe owner? Have you lost your mind completely? The racial slur hit Matthew like a physical blow, though he'd been expecting it. This was who his family truly was beneath their polish and pretense, people who measured worth by bloodlines and bank accounts. "Her name is Stephanie," Matthew said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that had made boardroom opponents quake. "And she's worth a dozen of anyone in this room." "How romantic," Cordelia said with false sweetness, "and how utterly inappropriate. Matthew, surely you understand that this little infatuation cannot continue. The family reputation The family reputation!" Matthew's control finally snapped, years of suppressed rage boiling over. "You mean the same reputation that was dragged through the mud when Vivian sold those photos to the tabloids? The same reputation you've been so concerned about while you've systematically destroyed everything decent about this family." "That's enough," Cordelia's mask slipped, revealing the viper beneath. "You are the heir to this family's legacy, and you will not throw it away for some common girl who sees nothing but dollar signs when she looks at you." "Stephanie doesn't even know who I really am," Matthew shot back, then immediately regretted the admission. Cordelia's smile was triumphant. "Doesn't she? How deliciously naive you are, darling. Do you really think a struggling business owner would be interested in a disabled man with no apparent prospects? She's playing a very clever game." The words hit their target with surgical precision. Matthew had wondered in his darkest moments whether Stephanie's interest was genuine, whether anyone could truly love him for himself, not his title or his money. "I see the doubt in your eyes," Cordelia continued ruthlessly. "Deep down you know I'm right. This girl is using you, and when she discovers the truth about your wealth, she'll either demand payment for her silence or try to trap you into marriage. Either way, you lose." "You're wrong," Matthew said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Then tell her the truth. Tonight. Tell her exactly who you are, and watch how quickly her affections change." Octavius leaned forward, sensing weakness. "Or you could end this farce now and save yourself the humiliation. We've already arranged several social opportunities with appropriate young women. Lady Catherine Pemberton is recently returned from Switzerland." "No!" The word came out like a gunshot. "I won't be your performing seal anymore." "Then you'll lose everything," Cordelia said softly. "Your trust fund, your inheritance, your place in this family, all for a girl who wouldn't look twice at you if she knew you were just another broken aristocrat." The threat was real. Matthew had seen his family destroy others who'd crossed them. But as he sat in that opulent room, surrounded by people who shared his blood but none of his values, he realized he didn't care. "Maybe that's exactly what I want to find out," he said, rising from his chair with as much dignity as his injured leg would allow. As he walked toward the door, Cordelia's voice followed him like a curse. "You'll regret this, Matthew. And when that girl breaks your heart, don't come crawling back here expecting sympathy." Matthew paused at the threshold, his hand on the brass doorknob that his grandfather had installed. "The only thing I regret is spending so many years caring what any of you thought." The door closed behind him with finality, and Matthew knew there would be no going back. Now he had to find Stephanie and pray that what they'd built together was strong enough to survive the truth. Because tonight, one way or another, all his secrets would finally come to light. Chapter 4. Hearts Entwined. Love is the only truth that makes liars of us all, and the only lie that makes us completely honest. Stephanie had never believed in perfect moments until she found herself wrapped in Matthew's arms on her tiny apartment balcony, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and crimson. 3 days had passed since their kiss at the cafe, and each moment they'd spent together had felt like stepping deeper into a dream she was terrified to wake up from. "Tell me something nobody else knows about you," Matthew murmured against her temple, his breath warm on her skin. They were curled together on the old wicker love seat she'd inherited from her grandmother, a blanket draped over their legs against the evening chill. Stephanie tilted her head to look at him, marveling at how relaxed he seemed in her modest space. Her entire apartment could fit in the master bedroom of the houses his accent suggested he'd grown up in, but he never seemed uncomfortable here. If anything, he appeared more at ease than he did anywhere else, though she'd noticed the way his hand occasionally trembled when he reached for his coffee cup, and how he sometimes excused himself to the bathroom with a small pill bottle. Nobody else, she teased, tracing patterns on his chest through his shirt. That's a dangerous question, Matthew Gray. Maybe I like danger, he said, his storm grey eyes darkening with something that made her pulse race. Especially if it involves getting closer to you. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. This man, this beautiful, mysterious, impossibly gentle man, looked at her like she was the eighth wonder of the world. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. "All right," she said, settling more comfortably against his shoulder. "I used to sneak into the hotel where my mother cleaned rooms just to watch the guests in the lobby. I'd pretend I belonged there, that I was staying in one of the fancy suites instead of living in our studio apartment above the bodega." Matthew's arms tightened around her, and she felt a slight tremor in his grip, so faint she almost missed it. "How old were you?" "8. Maybe 9. Old enough to know we were different from those people, but young enough to believe I could pretend my way into their world." She laughed softly, but there was old pain in the sound. "I'd sit in the big leather chairs and order hot chocolate from room service, charging it to random room numbers. My mother was mortified when she found out. What did she do? Made me work extra shifts at the bodega to pay back every penny." Stephanie smiled at the memory. "But she also sat me down and told me that I didn't need to pretend to be someone else to be worthy of beautiful things. That someday I'd earn them myself." Matthew was quiet for a long moment, his fingers threading through her hair. She noticed him discreetly checking his watch, a gesture she'd seen him make several times throughout the evening, as if counting hours until something. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," he said finally. "She is. She'd like you, I think." The words slipped out before Stephanie could stop them, and she felt heat flood her cheeks. "I mean, when, you know." "I'd like to meet her," Matthew said seriously. "Your whole family, actually. You talk about them like they're incredible people." "They are." Stephanie's voice grew warm with affection. "My parents sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had. Dad worked 2 jobs while going to night school to get his engineering degree. Mom cleaned offices until she saved enough to open her catering business. They taught me that honest work has its own dignity, no matter what anyone else thinks." Something flickered across Matthew's face. Guilt, maybe, or recognition. His hand found the small pill bottle in his jacket pocket, fingers closing around it like a lifeline. "They sound extraordinary. No wonder they raised such an amazing daughter." "Your turn," Stephanie said, deflecting from the compliment that made her heart flutter. "Tell me something nobody else knows about Matthew Gray." The question hung between them like a challenge. Matthew's expression grew complicated, as if he were weighing words on some internal scale she couldn't see. She watched him swallow hard and noticed the way his jaw clenched. A habit she was beginning to recognize appeared when he was fighting some internal battle. "I used to hide in the library at school," he said finally. "Not because I was particularly studious, but because it was the only place where people weren't staring at me. After the accident that damaged my leg, everyone either looked at me with pity or avoided me entirely. But in the library, I could just be another person reading." Stephanie's heart ached for the lonely boy he must have been. "How old were you when it happened?" 12. Matthew's voice grew distant, and she saw him unconsciously touch the pill bottle again. "Car accident. My parents were arguing in the front seat about me, actually. Whether I should go to boarding school or stay home for tutoring, the truck ran a red light and I spent 6 months in hospitals learning to walk again. Oh, Matthew. Stephanie sat up to face him fully, her hands cupping his face. I'm so sorry. The worst part wasn't the pain or the physical therapy, he continued, his eyes locked on hers. It was realizing that even my own family saw me as broken afterward, something to be managed rather than loved. And the medications. He trailed off, looking away. The medications? Matthew was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. They started with legitimate pain management, surgery after surgery, months of recovery, but somewhere along the way, the pills became necessary for more than just physical pain. And my family, they used that dependency as another way to control me. The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Stephanie felt something shift in her understanding of this man, the careful way he timed his bathroom breaks, the slight tremor in his hands, the shadows she sometimes glimpsed behind his eyes. Matthew, she said gently, are you still trying to stop? He said quickly. I've been reducing the dosage. It's why I moved out of the family estate, why I've been trying to live differently, but withdrawal is... He laughed bitterly. Let's just say it's not pretty. Is that why you seemed nervous about tonight? I was terrified you'd notice, that you'd see me as just another rich addict who can't get his life together. His laugh was shaky. The irony is that you make me want to be better. For the first time in years, I have a reason to fight this thing. The raw honesty in his confession broke something open in Stephanie's chest. This man who carried himself with such quiet dignity had been fighting demons she couldn't have imagined, battling not just his family's control, but his own body's betrayal. You're not broken, she said fiercely. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. And if you're fighting this, then you're not fighting it alone anymore. Matthew's smile was brilliant and heartbreaking at the same time. You terrify me, he admitted, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with reverent gentleness. The way you make me feel, the things I want when I'm with you. I've never experienced anything like it. You make me want to be worthy of the way you look at me. Stephanie's breath caught as she saw the naked vulnerability in his eyes. This powerful, educated, sophisticated man was as lost in this as she was, and fighting harder battles than she'd ever imagined. Matthew, she whispered, and then his lips were on hers, desperate and seeking and full of everything they hadn't said aloud. The kiss deepened, and Stephanie felt herself falling into sensation. Matthew's hands in her hair, the solid warmth of his body beneath hers, the way he murmured her name like a prayer against her skin. When he pulled back, they were both breathing hard. Stephanie, I need to tell you something else, he started, but she silenced him with another kiss. Later, she said against his lips. Whatever it is, we'll deal with it later. All of it. Matthew seemed to wrestle with himself for a moment, then surrendered to the inevitable. Later, he agreed, and lifted her into his arms with surprising strength. Her bedroom was small and simple, white linens, second-hand furniture, fairy lights strung around the window that cast everything in a warm glow. But when Matthew laid her gently on the bed, looking at her like she was the most precious thing he'd ever held, it felt like the most romantic place on earth. Are you sure? He asked, his voice rough with desire, but his eyes soft with concern. In answer, she pulled him down to her, and they lost themselves in whispered confessions and gentle touches. Matthew made love to her with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes, worshipping every inch of her skin like he was memorizing her. And when they finally came together, it was with an intensity that shook them both to their foundations, a desperate joining that felt like salvation for wounds neither had fully acknowledged. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, Stephanie's head on Matthew's chest, as his fingers traced lazy patterns on her shoulder. The fairy lights cast dancing shadows on the walls, and she could hear the distant sounds of the city settling into evening. "Stephanie," Matthew said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up at him. "There are things about my life, my family, that are even more complicated than the addiction. Things that could put you in danger if they knew how much you mean to me." A chill ran down her spine, despite the warmth of his embrace. What kind of danger? Matthew was quiet for so long she began to think he wouldn't answer. Then, "My family doesn't just control me through medication access. They have resources, influence, connections that reach into every corner of this city, and they see anyone I care about as a threat to that control. Are you saying I'm not safe?" "I'm saying that loving you might be the most selfish thing I've ever done," Matthew admitted, his voice breaking slightly, "because I can't bear the thought of losing you, even though staying with me puts you at risk." Stephanie searched his eyes, seeing truth there, but also a love so deep it took her breath away. "Then we'll be careful. We'll be smart about this." "But not this one," Stephanie said firmly, surprising herself with her certainty. "I fell for you when I thought you were just some guy with kind eyes who helped struggling customers. Your family situation doesn't change that. Your addiction doesn't change that. Whatever dangers come, we'll face them together." Matthew's smile was brilliant and heartbreaking at the same time. "I love you," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out like he couldn't hold them back. "I know it's too soon, and I know this is all complicated, but I love you, Stephanie Catley. You make me want to be the man I was before everything went wrong." "I love you too," she whispered, and kissed him with all the fierce tenderness in her heart. "And you're already that man. You've been him all along." They made love again as the city lights flickered on around them, slower this time, savoring each touch and whispered endearment. And if Stephanie noticed that Matthew's hands shook slightly less when he was holding her, she chose to see it as proof that love could indeed be medicine for wounds that ran deeper than any blade could cut. Whatever secrets he was keeping, whatever complications lay ahead, she was confident that what they had was strong enough to survive it. After all, love was supposed to conquer everything, wasn't it? Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Stephanie fell asleep in Matthew's arms, dreaming of a future where nothing else mattered but the way he looked at her like she was his salvation. She had no way of knowing that 3 blocks away, a photographer with a telephoto lens was already uploading pictures, or that by morning, those images would change everything, forcing Matthew to choose between his recovery and her safety in ways that would test whether love really could conquer the demons that lived in plain sight. Chapter 5. Dangerous Deceptions. The cruelest wars are fought not with weapons, but with whispers that poison everything they touch. The photographs arrived at Ryan Moore Estate at precisely 9 a.m., delivered by a discreet courier who disappeared as quickly as he'd come. Cordelia Ryan spread them across the polished mahogany dining table like a general planning a siege, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the wood as she studied each image with calculating precision. Matthew and Stephanie on her apartment balcony, silhouetted against the sunset. Matthew carrying Stephanie across the threshold of her bedroom, their shadows visible through sheer curtains, bodies intertwined in unmistakable intimacy. "Well," Cordelia murmured to herself, "this certainly escalates matters." The photographs were damning not just for their intimacy, but for what they revealed about Matthew's state of mind. In every image, he looked completely, utterly happy. An expression Cordelia hadn't seen on her stepson's face since before his father's death 5 years ago. That happiness, more than the scandal of his lover's race or class, convinced her that desperate measures were now required. "Octavius," she called, her voice carrying the authority of generations of Ryan matriarchs. "We need to discuss strategy." Her biological son appeared within moments, his face lighting up with malicious glee as he surveyed the photographs. "Oh, this is perfect. Matthew's finally given us enough rope to hang him with." Don't be crass, Cordelia chided, though her smile was equally vicious. This situation requires finesse, not brutality. We need to remove Miss Catley from the equation without making Matthew into a martyr. What did you have in mind? Cordelia's smile widened, revealing teeth as sharp as a shark's. Something that will make the girl run from Matthew herself, while teaching my stepson a valuable lesson about the consequences of defying family expectations. 3 blocks away from the Ryan estate, Stephanie stood in the community center's meeting room, surrounded by 24 small business owners who looked as frustrated and desperate as she felt. The monthly Small Business Alliance meeting had been called to address a rash of sudden code violations and inspection failures that were plaguing establishments throughout the Arts District. "It's like they're targeting us specifically," complained Tom Reeves, who owned the vintage bookstore next to her cafe. "I've been in business for 15 years, and suddenly I'm failing health inspections for dust on books that haven't been opened in months." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Sarah Kim from the pottery studio had been cited for noise violations that had never been an issue before. The organic grocery on the corner was facing licensing challenges that threatened to shut them down permanently. "Has anyone else noticed the timing?" asked Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who ran the flower shop. "All of these problems started about 2 weeks ago." Stephanie's stomach clenched with sudden understanding. 2 weeks ago was exactly when Matthew had confronted his family about their relationship. The timing couldn't be coincidental. "I think," she said slowly, her voice carrying across the room, "someone is trying to force us out of the neighborhood." "But who would have that kind of influence?" Tom asked. "And why?" Stephanie thought about Matthew's expensive watch, his educated accent, his easy familiarity with financial planning that most people paid professionals to handle. She thought about his vague answers about his family's wealth and his warnings about their cruelty. "I might know," she said quietly, "but I need to make some calls first." The meeting broke up with promises to compare notes and share resources, but Stephanie barely heard the closing remarks. Her mind was racing, connecting dots she'd been willfully blind to for weeks. By the time she returned to Café Luna, her hands were shaking as she unlocked the door. The familiar space that had always felt like a sanctuary now seemed vulnerable, exposed. How naive had she been to think that Matthew's mysterious family wouldn't eventually become her problem? The brass bell chimed, and she looked up to see an elegantly dressed woman in her 50s entering the cafe. The stranger was beautiful in the way that only serious money could achieve, her silver hair perfectly styled, her clothing clearly custom-made, her posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about paying bills. "Miss Catley?" The woman's voice was cultured, pleasant, and somehow deeply threatening. "I'm Helen Morrison, from the Morrison Foundation. We support local businesses in transitional neighborhoods." "Oh." Stephanie forced a smile, though every instinct screamed danger. "That's wonderful. Can I get you something to drink?" "Coffee would be lovely. Black." Stephanie busied herself with the espresso machine, acutely aware that the woman was studying every inch of the cafe with calculating eyes. When she turned back with the cup, Helen Morrison was examining the framed photographs on the wall, images of community events, local artists, the neighborhood kids who came in for hot chocolate after school. "You've built something quite special here," Helen said, accepting the coffee with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It would be a shame if it were to disappear." "Disappear?" Stephanie's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "Well, you know how these transitional neighborhoods can be. Property values rise, taxes increase, small businesses get squeezed out by developers." Helen sipped her coffee delicately. The Morrison Foundation tries to help promising entrepreneurs navigate these challenges, but of course, we can only do so much. "I see." Stephanie crossed her arms over her chest, recognizing the threat hidden in the pleasant words. And what would the foundation require in return for this help? Helen's smile grew wider, more predatory. Oh, nothing too demanding. We simply like to ensure that the business owners we support are suitable ambassadors for the community, people of good character who won't embarrass themselves or their sponsors. The emphasis on suitable hit Stephanie like a slap. This wasn't really about business development. It was about her relationship with Matthew. Somehow this woman knew exactly who she was and why she mattered. "I appreciate the offer," Stephanie said carefully, "but I prefer to handle my business independently." How admirably naive. Helen set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Miss Catley, let me be more direct. There are certain influential families in this city who take a keen interest in protecting their investments in up-and-coming neighborhoods. When those families feel that their interests are threatened, they have ways of expressing their displeasure." "Are you threatening me?" The question came out steadier than Stephanie felt. "I'm offering you a choice." Helen reached into her designer purse and withdrew a business card, placing it carefully on the counter between them. The Morrison Foundation can be a very valuable ally or a very problematic enemy. The decision is entirely yours. And what exactly would this alliance require? Helen's mask finally slipped, revealing cold calculation beneath the pleasant exterior. Distance yourself from certain individuals whose association might be detrimental to your business prospects. Focus on building relationships within your own community, with people who share your background and understand your challenges. The racist subtext was impossible to miss. Stephanie felt anger rising in her chest, hot and clean and powerful. "You mean stop seeing Matthew? I mean make intelligent choices about your future." Helen stood, smoothing down her skirt with practiced elegance. "You're a smart woman, Miss Catley. Surely you realize that some relationships come with costs that far exceed their benefits." "Get out!" Stephanie's voice was quiet but deadly. "I beg your pardon?" "Get out of my cafe, now!" For a moment, the two women stared at each other across the small space, the battle lines clearly drawn. Then Helen smiled, an expression devoid of any warmth. "We'll see about that," she said softly, and walked out without another word. Stephanie stood frozen behind the counter for several minutes after the woman left, her mind reeling from the encounter. The business card still lay where Helen had placed it, and she picked it up with trembling fingers. The Morrison Foundation. A quick internet search on her phone revealed an impressive website full of community development initiatives and glowing testimonials. But when she scrolled through the board of directors, her blood turned to ice. There, listed among the prominent philanthropists and business leaders, was Cordelia Ryan, Matthew's stepmother. The cafe's bell chimed again, and Matthew walked in with his usual warm smile, carrying takeout bags from their favorite Thai restaurant. "Surprise! I thought we could have lunch together." He stopped mid-sentence, seeing her expression. "Stephanie, what's wrong?" She held up the business card wordlessly, watching his face drain of color as he read it. "Oh, God." Matthew sank into the nearest chair, his cane clattering to the floor. "Stephanie, I can explain." "Can you?" Her voice was unnaturally calm. "Because I'm starting to think I don't know you at all, Matthew. Or should I say, Lord Matthew?" The title hung between them like a blade, and Matthew's stricken expression told her everything she needed to know. "You know," he said quietly, "I know that you've been lying to me from the moment we met. I know that your family is wealthy enough to manipulate city inspectors and threaten local businesses. I know that some woman who works for your stepmother just offered to destroy my life if I don't stop seeing you." Stephanie's voice was rising now, weeks of suppressed doubts and fears pouring out. "What I don't know is who the hell you really are." Matthew tried to stand, reaching for her, but she stepped back. "My name is Matthew Ryan," he said desperately. "I'm the Baron of Ryan Moore. which is a mostly meaningless British title my grandfather purchased in the 1920s. My family owns shipping companies, real estate developments, and apparently charitable foundations that threaten innocent people." His voice broke. "But everything I've told you about myself, about how I feel about you, all of that is true." "Is it?" Stephanie felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. "Because the man I fell in love with was honest and kind and treated me like an equal. The man standing in front of me is a liar who's been playing dress-up in my world while his family plots to destroy it." "That's not fair," Matthew said, but his protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Fair?" Stephanie laughed bitterly. "You want to talk about fair? Fair is warning someone when your relationship might cost them everything they've worked for. Fair is being honest about who you are, instead of letting them fall in love with a fantasy." Matthew's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the broken 12-year-old boy he'd told her about. "I was going to tell you. I tried to tell you last night. But you didn't." The words came out flat, final. "You made love to me while knowing that your family was probably already planning to destroy my life." "I would never let them hurt you," Matthew said fiercely. "You already have." The simple statement hit him like a physical blow. Stephanie turned away, unable to look at the pain in his eyes without her resolve crumbling. "I think you should go," she said quietly. "And I think we need some time apart while I figure out what's real and what's been performance." "Stephanie, please." "Go, Matthew." Her voice was steady now, empty of everything except exhaustion. "Just go." She didn't turn around to watch him leave, but she heard his footsteps, slower and heavier than usual, and the soft chime of the bell as the door closed behind him. Only then did she allow herself to cry. Chapter 6. Shattered Illusions. The cruelest discovery is not that someone has lied to you, but that you helped them do it by wanting so desperately to believe. Stephanie spent the night after Matthew's revelation sitting on her apartment floor, surrounded by laptop printouts and coffee-stained tissues, researching everything she could find about the Ryan family empire. What she discovered made her feel like the biggest fool who'd ever lived. Baron Matthew Ryan, heir to a shipping and real estate fortune worth over $2 billion, graduate of Harvard Business School, former fiancé of socialite Vivian Pemberton, whose leaked intimate photos had caused a scandal that dominated society pages for months. Current head of Ryan Industries Charitable Foundation and board member of a dozen prestigious organizations. The man she'd fallen in love with, the man who'd claimed to understand her struggles while battling his own addiction, had more money in his checking account than she'd see in 10 lifetimes. "You idiot," she whispered to her empty apartment, staring at a photograph of Matthew in a tuxedo at some gala, looking every inch the aristocrat he'd been born to be. "You absolute idiot." But even as she felt the betrayal cut deep, she couldn't forget the tremor in his hands when he'd confessed his dependency, the genuine shame in his voice when he'd talked about his family's control. The addiction was real. The pain was real. But so were the lies. Her phone buzzed with another text from Matthew. She'd stopped reading them hours ago, but the constant notifications were like needles under her skin. Finally, she turned the phone off entirely and tried to sleep. She failed spectacularly. The next morning arrived grey and drizzling, matching her mood perfectly. Stephanie dragged herself to Café Luna early, hoping that the familiar routine of opening would provide some comfort. The street seemed unusually quiet. No morning joggers, no dog walkers, none of the usual neighborhood bustle. She should have recognized it as a warning sign. The smell hit her first, something acrid and chemical that made her nose burn. Then she saw the smoke seeping from beneath the cafe's back door, and her blood turned to ice. "Fire!" she screamed, though the street was empty. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her keys. but the front door was already hot to the touch. Through the window, she could see flames licking at her counter, her equipment, everything she'd worked for, dissolving into smoke and ash. She pulled out her phone to call 911, but before she could dial, strong hands grabbed her from behind. "Miss Catley?" The voice was cultured, pleasant, and coldly familiar. Helen Morrison, the woman from the fake charity foundation, stepped into view, no longer bothering with her kindly benefactor act. Such a terrible accident, old buildings, faulty wiring, these things happen. "You did this." Stephanie's voice was steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You're destroying my cafe." "I'm solving a problem," Helen corrected, her smile sharp as a blade. "Lady Cordelia gave you multiple opportunities to distance yourself from her stepson voluntarily. You chose to ignore those opportunities." The hands holding Stephanie belonged to two men in expensive suits, not thugs, but corporate enforcers who looked like they'd stepped out of a boardroom. The kind of violence that came with liability waivers and legal disclaimers. "Where is he?" Stephanie demanded, trying to twist free. "Where's Matthew?" "Lord Matthew is currently dealing with a family emergency at the estate," Helen said pleasantly. "Something about a relapse in his recovery program. Such a shame when addicts fall off the wagon. They become so unreliable. Sometimes they even become dangerous to themselves and others." The implications hit Stephanie like a physical blow. They'd sabotaged his recovery, probably cut off his medication entirely or given him contaminated pills. While she was dealing with this fire, Matthew was fighting withdrawal, or worse, completely alone. "You're monsters," she breathed. "We're pragmatists," Helen corrected, "and we're very good at making problems disappear permanently." One of the suited men leaned close to Stephanie's ear. "The fire's already been called in as an electrical accident. Happens all the time in old buildings with overloaded circuits. Very tragic when the owner tries to save her business and gets trapped inside." The plan was suddenly, horribly clear. They weren't just going to destroy her cafe. They were going to kill her and make it look like a tragic accident. No more inconvenient girlfriend, no more threat to family control. "People will know," Stephanie said desperately. "My neighbors, my employees, will mourn a brave young woman who died trying to save her business." Helen finished smoothly. Such an inspiring story, really. The poor cafe owner who tried to rescue her life's work. Very American dream. The flames were spreading now, and Stephanie could hear sirens in the distance, probably responding to the accidental fire report these people had already called in. In minutes, this would all be over. Her cafe destroyed, her life ended, and Matthew left, believing she'd died in an accident while he was too drugged or sick to help her. "Please," she whispered, hating herself for begging but desperate to live. "I'll leave. I'll disappear. You'll never see me again." "Too late for that, I'm afraid," Helen said with false sympathy. "You've already seen too much, know too much, and Lady Cordelia is very thorough about loose ends." The suited men began dragging her toward the burning building, and Stephanie realized with crystal clarity that she was about to die. Not in some dramatic confrontation, but as a footnote in a rich family's campaign to control their heir. She'd be a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened to people who reached above their station. That's when the black Range Rover came screaming around the corner, tires smoking as it took the turn too fast. Matthew burst from the vehicle before it had fully stopped, his usually perfect appearance disheveled, his face gaunt with what looked like withdrawal, but his eyes blazing with fury. Behind the wheel, Edmund sat rigid with determination, clearly having broken every traffic law getting here. "Let her go," Matthew's voice carried across the street with deadly, quiet authority. "Now." Helen's mask of pleasantness finally slipped completely. "Lord Matthew, you should be resting. You've had such a difficult morning." "I know exactly what kind of morning you arranged for me," Matthew snarled, his hands shaking. But not from withdrawal now, from rage, cut-off medication, contaminated water supply, locked doors, very creative, but you underestimated Edmund's lock-picking skills. The older man had indeed gotten Matthew out, and from the looks of it, they'd both figured out what was happening here just in time. "This is unfortunate," Helen said calmly, gesturing to her enforcers, "but manageable. Tragic when drug addicts have violent episodes. Sometimes they hurt innocent people before the overdose takes them." The implications were clear. They'd kill Matthew too and blame it on his addiction. Two problems eliminated with one manufactured crisis. But Matthew was already moving, his cane forgotten as he grabbed a piece of construction debris and swung it at the first enforcer's head. Years of physical therapy had left him stronger than he looked, and his desperation gave him speed. The man went down hard. The second enforcer pulled a gun, but Edmund was already there, moving with surprising agility for a man his age. The weapon went spinning across the pavement as the two men wrestled. Helen reached into her purse, probably for another gun, but Stephanie broke free from her shock and tackled the older woman, both of them hitting the ground hard. "Stephanie!" Matthew was beside her instantly, pulling her away from Helen. "Are you hurt?" "The fire," she gasped. "They set fire to my cafe." Matthew's face went murderous as he turned toward Helen, who was struggling to her feet with blood streaming from her nose. "You tried to kill her," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "You burned down her business and tried to murder the woman I love." "Your family's business," Helen corrected, wiping blood from her lip. "This was all authorized by Lady Cordelia. I'm simply following orders." "Then my stepmother just declared war," Matthew said quietly. "And she's going to lose." The sirens were getting closer now. Real fire trucks, real police, drawn by the very public disturbance Helen's people had never anticipated. In minutes, this quiet street would be crawling with witnesses and authorities. Helen seemed to realize her situation had become untenable. She signaled to her remaining conscious enforcer, and they began backing toward a waiting sedan. "This isn't over," she called out. "Lord Matthew, you have no idea what your family is capable of when truly motivated." "Neither do you," Matthew replied grimly, pulling Stephanie closer. "But you're about to find out." As Helen and her people disappeared into the morning traffic, Stephanie looked at her cafe, her life's work, going up in flames. Everything she'd built, everything she'd worked for, reduced to smoke and ash because she'd fallen in love with the wrong man. "I'm so sorry," Matthew whispered against her hair. "This is all my fault. They did this because of me." "No," Stephanie said firmly, surprising herself with her certainty. "They did this because they're evil. There's a difference." But even as she said it, she knew everything had changed. This wasn't about class differences or family disapproval anymore. Someone had just tried to kill her to control Matthew's inheritance. The stakes had moved beyond money, beyond social status, into life and death. And looking at Matthew's face as he watched her cafe burn, seeing the guilt and rage and determination there, she realized he was planning something that would put them both in even greater danger. The war with the Ryan family had just begun in earnest, and Stephanie was no longer sure love would be enough to keep either of them alive to see how it ended. Chapter 7. The Proposal Trap. Hell is not a place of fire and brimstone. It's watching the person you love suffer because of who you are. Matthew stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment, watching the media circus surrounding Café Luna through high-powered binoculars, his heart breaking with each photograph the paparazzi snapped. From his vantage point 30 floors above the chaos, Stephanie's small sanctuary looked like a crime scene, surrounded by vultures feeding on the destruction of her privacy. He'd been calling her for 3 days straight. Every call went to voicemail, every text went unanswered. He'd even tried showing up at her apartment, only to find it surrounded by the same reporters who'd turned her cafe into a spectacle. The doorman, bribed or threatened by someone, undoubtedly his family, refused to let him enter the building. "Sir?" Edmund appeared behind him, carrying a silver tray with Matthew's untouched breakfast. "You need to eat something." "I need to fix this," Matthew said without turning around. He adjusted the binoculars, trying to catch a glimpse of Stephanie through the cafe's windows. "She won't even talk to me, Edmund. How can I fix this if she won't let me explain?" "Perhaps," Edmund said carefully. "The young lady needs time to process what's happened. Having one's private life splashed across tabloids would be traumatic for anyone, especially someone unaccustomed to that level of scrutiny." Matthew lowered the binoculars, his reflection ghost-like in the window glass. 3 days without sleep had left him haggard, his usually perfect appearance disheveled. "It's my fault. All of it. I should have told her the truth from the beginning. Sir, if I may, your family orchestrated this media attention. The photographs, the fake business alliance letter, even the reporters showing up at precisely the right moment. This isn't coincidence or bad luck." Matthew's jaw tightened. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his fury burn even hotter. "Have you found proof?" "I've found connections," Edmund said diplomatically. "The photographer who took the balcony pictures has done work for several society magazines that your stepmother has considerable influence with. The Arts District Business Improvement Alliance was incorporated 3 days ago by a law firm that handles the Ryan Foundation's legal matters." "Enough proof to confront them?" Edmund's expression was troubled. "Sir, confronting your family now might make things worse for Miss Stephanie. They're holding all the cards at the moment." Matthew turned away from the window, rage and helplessness warring in his chest. "Then what do you suggest I do? Let them destroy the woman I love while I stand by and watch?" "I suggest," Edmund said quietly, "that you consider making a strategic retreat. Give Miss Stephanie space to deal with this crisis without the additional burden of managing your family's expectations. Show your love by stepping back, not charging forward." The suggestion felt like surrender, but Matthew could see the wisdom in it. Every attempt he'd made to reach Stephanie had only brought more attention, more scrutiny. His presence in her life had become toxic, no matter how pure his intentions. His phone buzzed with an incoming call, and his stepmother's name flashed on the screen. Matthew had been ignoring Cordelia's calls for days, but something about the timing made him answer. "Matthew, darling." Cordelia's voice was syrupy with false concern. "I hope you're feeling better after your recent difficulties." "Cut the act, Cordelia. We both know you orchestrated this entire nightmare." "Such accusations," she tusked. "I'm simply calling to extend an invitation. Lady Catherine Pemberton is hosting a charity luncheon tomorrow at the Riverside Club. Very intimate, very tasteful. It would be an excellent opportunity for you to remind society that you're still a Ryan, despite recent associations. I'm not interested in your social rehabilitation tour." "Matthew," Cordelia's voice hardened, "this media attention is damaging the entire family's reputation. Octavius's business partnerships are suffering. My foundation work is being questioned. Your grandfather's legacy is being tarnished by tabloid headlines about his heir's inappropriate romantic choices." "Good," Matthew said viciously. "Maybe it's time people knew what this family really stands for. Don't be naive. You can rage against the family all you want, but ultimately you'll come crawling back. You always do. And when you do, I want to be able to tell our friends and business partners that this was simply a temporary lapse in judgment, not a fundamental character flaw." Matthew was about to hang up when Cordelia played her ace. "Of course, if you prefer to continue this rebellion, I'm sure Miss Catley won't mind the ongoing attention. I hear the health department is planning another inspection of her cafe tomorrow. Such a shame if they found violations that required immediate closure pending a full review." The threat was clear, and Matthew felt something cold settle in his stomach. You wouldn't. Wouldn't I? Matthew, darling, you seem to forget that I've been playing this game much longer than you have. Miss Catley's little cafe exists at my sufferance, not as a matter of right. Matthew closed his eyes, seeing the trap his stepmother had so carefully constructed. Every move he made to protect Stephanie only gave his family more ammunition to use against her. The only way to keep her safe was to give them what they wanted, his public surrender. One lunch, he said finally, but I won't pretend to be interested in Catherine or anyone else you've selected for me. Oh, darling, I'm not asking you to pretend anything. Just be yourself, charming, educated, appropriate. Let people see that you remember who you are and where you belong. The call ended, leaving Matthew staring at his reflection in the darkened phone screen. Edmund was watching him with concern, clearly having overheard enough to understand what had just happened. Sir, you don't have to do this. There are other ways to protect Miss Stephanie. Are there? Matthew laughed bitterly. My family has unlimited resources, unlimited influence, and absolutely no conscience. The only weapon I have against them is my cooperation. The charity luncheon was everything Matthew had expected and despised. 200 of society's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their charitable contributions while drinking champagne that cost more than most people made in a month. He moved through the crowd like a sleepwalker, accepting condolences about his recent difficulties and deflecting questions about his future plans. Lady Catherine Pemberton was beautiful in the way that only serious money and careful breeding could achieve. Tall, blonde, impeccably educated, and completely bloodless. She spoke knowledgeably about art and politics, shared amusing anecdotes about mutual acquaintances, and made it clear that she found Matthew attractive despite his recent indiscretions. Under any other circumstances, Matthew might have found her pleasant enough company. Instead, he found himself comparing everything about her to Stephanie, her perfectly modulated voice to Stephanie's warm laughter, her careful conversation to Stephanie's passionate opinions, her designer gown to the simple sundress Stephanie had worn on their first real date. You seem distracted, Catherine observed, as they sat at the head table, picking at their artfully arranged salads. I hope the recent media attention hasn't been too difficult. It's been educational, Matthew said carefully. Catherine lowered her voice conspiratorially. Between us, I think you handled it all quite well. Everyone has youthful indiscretions, and you're hardly the first man to be taken in by an ambitious social climber. The casual cruelty of the assessment hit Matthew like a physical blow. Stephanie isn't a social climber. Of course not, Catherine said quickly, clearly realizing she'd overstepped. I simply meant that people will understand if you were misled about someone's intentions. It happens to the best of us. Matthew opened his mouth to defend Stephanie more forcefully, but caught sight of his stepmother watching them from across the room. Cordelia's smile was victorious, satisfied, and Matthew realized with growing horror that he was playing directly into her hands. The trap had been perfectly constructed. By appearing publicly with Catherine, by allowing people to assume he was moving on from his relationship with Stephanie, he was inadvertently validating every cruel assumption about his motives. The society photographers capturing their conversation would create exactly the narrative his family wanted, that Matthew had recognized his mistake and returned to his proper social circle. "Excuse me," he said abruptly, standing so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. "Matthew!" Catherine looked puzzled. "Where are you going?" "I need some air." Matthew escaped to the club's terrace, where the October wind cut through his suit jacket like a blade. Below, the city spread out in all directions, and somewhere in that maze of lights and shadows, Stephanie was probably wondering if everything they'd shared had been a lie. His phone buzzed with a text from Edmund. "Sir, you should see the evening news." With growing dread, Matthew opened his browser and searched for his own name. The headlines made his blood freeze. Lord Ryan steps out with Lady Catherine. From cafe to country club, Baron's new romance. Matthew Ryan moves on from barista scandal. The photographs told the story his family had wanted. Matthew and Catherine in intimate conversation, his hand briefly touching hers as he'd helped her with her chair, both of them smiling at some shared joke. To anyone looking at these images, it would appear that he'd already forgotten about Stephanie and moved on to someone more appropriate. Matthew stared at the photos in horror, imagining Stephanie seeing them, imagining what she must think. That their entire relationship had been meaningless to him. That she'd been nothing more than a temporary rebellion, easily discarded when his family applied pressure. He tried calling her immediately, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He tried texting, but the messages showed as undelivered. It was as if she'd disappeared entirely, erasing herself from his life as thoroughly as his family had wished. "Sir?" Edmund appeared on the terrace, his expression grim. "I've been monitoring the situation. Miss Stephanie closed the cafe early today and hasn't been seen since. Her neighbors report that she's been packing boxes." "She's leaving," Matthew said numbly. "It appears so, sir." Matthew gripped the terrace railing, his knuckles white with pressure. In trying to protect Stephanie, he'd given her the final proof she needed that he was exactly what his family had always claimed, a privileged man who played with people's hearts for sport. The worst part was that from her perspective, the evidence was overwhelming. He'd lied about his identity, his family had destroyed her reputation, and now he was publicly moving on with someone from his own social class. What conclusion could she possibly draw except that none of it had ever been real? Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Matthew felt the first drops of rain against his face. Somewhere in the city below, the woman he loved was packing her life into boxes, preparing to disappear forever because his love had become indistinguishable from cruelty. He'd lost her. Despite all his wealth and privilege and supposed power, he'd lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him, and this time he wasn't sure love would be enough to win her back. Chapter 8. Truth and Consequences. Sometimes the truth arrives too late to prevent heartbreak, but just in time to prevent a lifetime of regrets. The moving boxes sat stacked in Stephanie's temporary apartment, like tombstones marking the death of her old life. The insurance company had found a furnished place for her while investigating the electrical fire that had destroyed Café Luna, though both she and Matthew knew the truth would never officially see daylight. The Ryan family's influence reached too deep into the city's infrastructure for real justice through conventional channels. She'd spent 3 days in this sterile space, jumping at every sound, checking locks obsessively, and wondering if Helen Morrison's people were watching from the building across the street. The attempted murder had shattered her sense of safety in a way that no amount of Matthew's security could fully restore. The knock at her door was so soft she almost missed it, but the familiar cadence, 3 gentle raps, pause 2 more, told her it was Edmund even before she checked the peephole. "Miss Catley?" His voice carried the same elderly refinement as always, but there was something different underneath, a urgency she'd never heard before. "My name is Edmund Hartwell. We've met briefly, but I have something to tell you. Something that changes everything." Despite her better judgment, Stephanie found herself opening the door. Edmund stepped inside with his usual old-fashioned courtesy, but his typically perfect composure was cracked around the edges. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, his usually immaculate suit wrinkled as if he'd been up all night. "How is he?" she asked immediately. "Matthew." After the withdrawal they forced on him. "Recovering," Edmund said quietly. "Physically, at least. Emotionally." He shook his head. "He blames himself for what happened to you, for your cafe. He's barely eating, barely sleeping, talking about giving up his inheritance entirely if it will keep you safe." Stephanie's heart clenched. That's exactly what they want. Which is why I'm here. Edmund set down a worn leather satchel, his movements careful and deliberate. There are truths that have been buried for 34 years, Miss Catley. Truths that could change the balance of power in the Ryan family forever. Something in his tone made Stephanie sink into the nearest chair. What kind of truths? Edmund was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands with an expression she couldn't read. When he looked up, his eyes held a pain so deep it took her breath away. Lord Matthew is not just my employer, Miss Catley. He's my son. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Stephanie stared at Edmund, certain she'd misheard. What did you say? Matthew Ryan is my biological son, Edmund repeated, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I am his father. That's impossible. Stephanie's mind reeled, trying to process the implications. He said his father died 5 years ago. Car accident. Charles Ryan died in a car accident 5 years ago, Edmund confirmed. But Charles Ryan was not Matthew's biological father. I am. The room seemed to tilt sideways. But how? Why? Edmund opened the leather satchel and withdrew a manila folder thick with documents. In 1989, I was working as a security consultant for Ryan Industries. Catherine Ryan, Matthew's mother, was married to Charles, but it was a loveless arrangement, a merger of two wealthy families with no real affection between them. He handed Stephanie a photograph. A young black man in an expensive suit standing beside a beautiful white woman with Matthew's same storm-grey eyes. They were looking at each other with unmistakable love. Catherine and I fell in love, Edmund continued, his voice growing softer. We tried to fight it, tried to maintain proper boundaries, but... He shrugged helplessly. Love doesn't recognize social barriers, does it? But Matthew doesn't know. Edmund's laugh was bitter. No one knows. When Catherine became pregnant, we both knew the truth would destroy her marriage, her social position, her family's business connections. A white heiress having an affair with her black employee in 1989, it would have been scandalous beyond repair. Stephanie stared at the photograph, seeing Matthew's features in both faces now that she knew what to look for. The strong jawline from his father, the expressive eyes from his mother, the quiet dignity that Edmund carried like a birthright. So she stayed with Charles? Charles was traveling extensively that year. Catherine told him the child was his, conceived during one of his brief visits home. He never questioned it. Why would he? He had no reason to doubt his wife's fidelity. And you just accepted being shut out of your son's life? Edmund's composure finally cracked, and Stephanie saw the decades of suppressed pain flash across his face. I didn't have a choice. Catherine begged me to stay, to help raise him from the shadows. She arranged for me to be hired as the family's head of security, then later as Matthew's personal assistant. It was the only way I could be part of his life. The full scope of the sacrifice hit Stephanie like a physical blow. 34 years. You've been watching your son grow up, unable to claim him, unable to tell him who you really are. Watching him become a remarkable man despite his family's influence, not because of it, Edmund said with fierce pride. Watching him struggle with loneliness and addiction and family pressure, knowing I could help him if he only knew the truth about who he is. Why didn't you ever tell him? Because Catherine made me promise. On her deathbed, she made me swear I would never reveal the truth unless Matthew's life was in genuine danger. Edmund's voice grew hard. Well, Miss Catley, watching the woman he loves nearly burn to death in an orchestrated fire qualifies as genuine danger in my book. Stephanie looked through the documents Edmund had brought. DNA tests from when Matthew was a child, blood type comparisons, medical records that would prove paternity beyond any doubt. Everything needed to turn the Ryan family's world upside down. Lady Cordelia doesn't know. Lady Cordelia suspects, Edmund said grimly. She's always known Charles wasn't particularly attentive to Catherine during the relevant time period. I think she's suspected for years that Matthew isn't really Charles's son, but she could never prove it. And as long as Matthew remained under family control, it didn't matter. But if this came out now, it would destroy her plans completely, Edmund finished. Matthew's inheritance is tied to being Charles Ryan's legitimate heir. If it became public knowledge that he's actually the son of a black security consultant, the legal challenges alone would tie up the estate for years. And the scandal, he smiled grimly. The scandal would destroy Lady Cordelia's social standing permanently. Stephanie stared at the evidence spread across her coffee table, 34 years of suppressed truth that could change everything. You're planning to use this to stop them? I'm planning to save my son, Edmund corrected. And the woman who makes him happier than I've seen him since he was a child. Lady Cordelia wants a war. She'll get one. But she's about to discover she's been fighting the wrong enemy all along. What happens to you when this comes out? Your reputation, your career. Edmund's smile was serene, peaceful in a way Stephanie had never seen before. Miss Catley, I've spent 34 years pretending to be a servant in my own son's life. I've watched him suffer, watched him struggle with addiction and family manipulation, watched him believe he was unloved and unwanted. Do you really think I care about my reputation more than his happiness? He's going to be devastated, Stephanie said quietly, learning that his entire life has been built on a lie. Yes, Edmund agreed. But he's also going to learn that he's been loved unconditionally his entire life by someone who would have claimed him proudly if the world had been different. That's not nothing, Miss Catley. A knock at the door made them both freeze. 3 sharp raps, pause, then Matthew's voice. Stephanie? Edmund said he was coming to see you. I was worried. Edmund and Stephanie looked at each other across the coffee table covered in life-changing evidence. It's time, Edmund said quietly. He deserves to know the truth, all of it. Stephanie walked to the door on unsteady legs, her mind reeling from everything she'd learned. When she opened it, Matthew looked like hell, pale, shaky from withdrawal, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and guilt. But when he saw her face, concern immediately replaced everything else. What's wrong? He asked, stepping inside and immediately spotting Edmund beside the coffee table covered in documents. What's going on? Edmund stood slowly, drawing himself up to his full height, with the dignity Stephanie now realized came from strength, not servitude. Hello, son, he said quietly. I think it's time we had a proper conversation. Matthew froze, the words hanging in the air between them like a revelation that would change everything forever. The war with the Ryan family was about to become very personal indeed. Chapter 9. The Battle for Love. Courage is not the absence of fear, it's deciding that something else matters more than your terror. The morning of the legal hearing that would determine Matthew's fitness to inherit the Ryan estate dawned grey and bitter, with winds that cut through even the thickest coats. Stephanie stood outside the imposing granite courthouse, clutching a folder of documents and trying to find the courage she'd felt so certain of the night before. She'd spent hours after Edmund's visit researching the Ryan family's legal history, their business practices, their charitable foundation's actual impact versus their public claims. What she'd found had turned her stomach. A pattern of calculated cruelty disguised as philanthropy, tax evasion dressed up as charitable giving, and decades of using legal intimidation to silence anyone who threatened their interests. But she'd also found something else. Records of Matthew's actual charitable work, done quietly and without fanfare. Scholarships for underprivileged students that he'd funded personally. Small businesses he'd helped save through anonymous loans. Community centers that had received mysterious donations when they faced closure. The man she'd fallen in love with wasn't just real, he was exactly who she'd thought he was beneath all the lies his family had forced him to tell. "Miss Catley?" A familiar voice made her turn. Tom from the bookstore stood behind her, looking uncomfortable but determined. Behind him were Sarah from the pottery studio, Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop, and nearly a dozen other business owners from the arts district. "Tom." Stephanie was too surprised to hide her confusion. "What are you doing here?" "We came to testify," Tom said simply, "about what really happened in our neighborhood and who was actually responsible." "But I thought, the letters, the community pressure." Sarah stepped forward, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "We were scared, Stephanie, and we were wrong. After you left, we started comparing notes about the harassment we'd been receiving. The pattern was too obvious to ignore." Mrs. Patterson nodded vigorously. "My husband ran those fake charity letters through his forensic software. He used to work for the FBI, you know. The letterhead was professionally done, but the organization didn't exist until 3 days before we received them." "We realized we'd been played," Tom said quietly. "Someone wanted us to turn against you, and we fell for it. We're here to make that right." Stephanie felt tears threatening, but they were tears of gratitude now. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes, we did," Sarah said firmly. "You're part of our community, and we failed you when you needed us most. That's not happening again." The courthouse doors opened, and people began filing in. Stephanie saw Lady Cordelia arrive in a chauffeur-driven Bentley, dressed in black as if attending a funeral. Octavius followed in his own car, his expression smugly confident. A phalanx of expensive lawyers completed their entourage. "Miss Catley." Edmund appeared at her elbow, his face grave with concern. "Are you certain you want to do this? Lady Cordelia's attorneys will be ruthless." "I'm certain." Stephanie's voice was steadier than she felt. "Where is Matthew?" "Inside with his legal team. He doesn't know you're here." Edmund's expression was worried. "Miss Catley, I should warn you. Lord Matthew isn't well. This process has taken a significant toll on his mental state. He's been living at the estate for a week now, essentially under house arrest, watching his family systematically destroy his reputation and independence." Stephanie's heart clenched. "Have you been able to speak with him?" "Briefly. He asked me to tell you, if I ever saw you again, that he was sorry. For everything. He has nothing to be sorry for." The courtroom was imposing, dark wood paneling, high ceilings, and an atmosphere that spoke of grave consequences. Stephanie found a seat in the public gallery just as Matthew entered with his attorneys. The change in him was shocking. The confident, gentle man she'd fallen in love with had been replaced by someone who looked like he was barely holding himself together. His face was gaunt, his posture defeated, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and despair. Their gazes met across the courtroom, and Matthew's expression transformed into something between hope and terror. He mouthed her name silently, and Stephanie saw him grip his cane so tightly his knuckles went white. Lady Cordelia noticed the exchange and turned to see what had captured her stepson's attention. When she spotted Stephanie in the gallery, her face went cold with fury. "Your Honor," Lady Cordelia's lead attorney began when the judge called the session to order, "we're here today because Lord Matthew Ryan has demonstrated a pattern of increasingly erratic behavior that calls into question his mental fitness to inherit and manage the significant Ryan family assets." What followed was a systematic character assassination disguised as legal testimony. The family's attorneys presented evidence of Matthew's unstable relationships, his rejection of family responsibilities, his inappropriate associations with individuals of questionable character. They painted him as a mentally unstable playboy whose recent relationship with a social climber had been the final proof of his unfitness to handle billions of dollars in family assets. Matthew sat in silence, his lawyers objecting when they could, but clearly fighting an uphill battle. The family had prepared for this moment for months, gathering documentation and witness testimony designed to portray him as incompetent. "We call our first character witness," Matthew's attorney announced when it was their turn to present their case. Stephanie stood, her legs shaking, but her voice clear. "Your Honor, I'm Stephanie Catley." The reaction was immediate. Lady Cordelia's attorney leapt to his feet. "Objection! Miss Catley is hardly an appropriate character witness given her personal involvement with the respondent." "Overruled," the judge said calmly. "I'll allow the testimony." Stephanie walked to the witness stand on unsteady legs, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom following her movement. When she was sworn in, she looked directly at Matthew and drew strength from the amazement and gratitude in his eyes. "Miss Catley," Matthew's attorney began, "how long have you known Lord Matthew?" 2 months, Stephanie said clearly. "But in that time, I got to know him better than most people know anyone in a lifetime." "And what was your impression of his mental state and judgment during this period?" Stephanie chose her words carefully. "Matthew, Lord Matthew, is the most thoughtful, intelligent, and emotionally stable person I've ever met. He helped me solve complex financial problems with my business. He showed remarkable insight into community issues and demonstrated genuine concern for people struggling economically. His judgment was consistently sound, his behavior always appropriate." "But isn't it true," Lady Cordelia's attorney interjected during cross-examination, "that Lord Matthew deceived you about his true identity throughout your entire relationship?" "Yes," Stephanie admitted, "but I understand now why he felt that was necessary." "Really? Please enlighten us." Stephanie looked directly at Lady Cordelia. "He was trying to experience what it felt like to be loved for who he is as a person, rather than what he owns. Given the systematic surveillance and manipulation he's been subjected to by his own family, that seems like remarkably healthy self-protection." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Lady Cordelia's face was murderous, but the judge called for order. "Miss Catley," Matthew's attorney continued, "did you observe anything during your relationship that would suggest Lord Matthew was mentally unstable or incapable of managing significant financial assets?" "The opposite," Stephanie said firmly. "His insights into business management were sophisticated and practical. He helped me develop strategies that saved my cafe from bankruptcy. He understood complex financial instruments and could explain them clearly. If anything, he demonstrated exceptional competence in exactly the kind of thinking required to manage large estates." One by one, the business owners from the Arts District took the stand to testify about the systematic harassment they'd experienced. Harassment that began the moment Matthew's relationship with Stephanie became known to his family. They provided documentation of the fake Business Improvement Alliance, the coordinated inspection campaigns, the mysterious legal challenges that had appeared and disappeared in sync with the family's demands. Tom's testimony was particularly damaging to the family's case. "We were used as weapons against Miss Catley, and by extension against Lord Matthew. The Ryan family's charitable foundation created a fake organization and manipulated our community into turning against one of our own. That's not the behavior of a charitable institution. It's the behavior of a criminal enterprise." The judge listened to hours of testimony with increasing interest. When the last witness had spoken, he called for a recess to consider the evidence. During the break, Stephanie found herself face to face with Lady Cordelia in the courthouse corridor. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Lady Cordelia hissed, her cultured mask finally slipping completely. "You think this is some kind of fairy tale where love conquers all. Matthew is weak, just like his father. He'll destroy everything the Ryan name represents if he's allowed to inherit." "Maybe that's exactly what the Ryan name needs," Stephanie replied calmly. "Someone who cares more about doing right than looking respectable. You little mother." Matthew appeared beside them, using his cane but moving with more strength than Stephanie had seen from him all day. That's enough. Lady Cordelia smiled coldly. Matthew, darling, surely you're not going to let this girl destroy everything your grandfather built? No, Matthew said quietly. I'm going to let her help me build something better. He took Stephanie's hand, and she felt the tremor in his fingers, not from weakness, but from hope. The judge is returning, Edmund announced from the courtroom doors. As they filed back in, Stephanie saw something she'd never expected: uncertainty in Lady Cordelia's eyes. For the first time, the outcome wasn't guaranteed. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like they might actually win. Chapter 10, Crown of Hearts. True love stories don't end with happily ever after. They begin with two people brave enough to choose each other every single day. 6 months later, Stephanie stood in the morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of what had once been Ryan Moore Estate's most formal drawing room, watching Matthew direct the installation team hanging artwork created by local students. The space that had once showcased priceless antiques now displayed vibrant paintings, colorful sculptures, and photographs documenting the community programs that had transformed both the estate and their lives. The portrait of great-grandfather Horatio is spinning in his grave, Matthew observed with satisfaction as workers carefully positioned a mural depicting children from the arts district learning about urban gardening in what used to be Lady Cordelia's prized rose garden. Good, Stephanie said, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. Maybe now he'll understand what real legacy looks like. The judge's decision had been swift and definitive. After hearing testimony about the family's systematic harassment, their use of charitable organizations as weapons of intimidation, and the clear evidence of Matthew's mental competence and business acumen, he had not only upheld Matthew's right to inherit, but had also ordered an investigation into the Ryan Foundation's practices that eventually led to significant legal reforms in how charitable organizations could operate. Lady Cordelia and Octavius had been stripped of their positions within the family's business empire and had relocated to a family property in Switzerland, where they could nurse their grievances in expensive exile. The last Stephanie had heard, they were attempting to establish themselves in European high society, where American scandals carried less weight. The afternoon session starts in 20 minutes, Edmund announced, appearing in the doorway with his usual perfect timing. At 74, he showed no signs of slowing down, though his role had evolved from butler to chief operations officer of the Matthew Ryan Community Foundation. The scholarship recipients are arriving now. Stephanie smiled, remembering her nervousness before the first scholarship ceremony 3 months ago. Matthew had insisted that she co-chair the foundation, arguing that her understanding of community needs was essential to their mission. She'd been terrified of speaking to rooms full of wealthy donors, but Matthew's quiet confidence in her abilities had given her strength. "How many today?" Matthew asked, straightening his tie with the same careful attention he'd once used to disguise his identity. 37, Edmund reported, including 5 from the arts district, 12 from immigrant families, and 8 who are the first in their families to attend university. The numbers represented lives changed, dreams made possible, futures secured. Every scholarship was funded personally by Matthew, who had discovered that giving away his inherited wealth brought him more joy than he'd ever found in accumulating it. They walked together through the estate's transformed corridors, past rooms that had been converted into tutoring centers, art studios, and meeting spaces for community organizations. The grand ballroom now served as an event space for neighborhood celebrations, and the formal dining room had become a commercial kitchen where local entrepreneurs could develop their catering businesses. "Remember when you were afraid I'd be overwhelmed by all this wealth and privilege?" Stephanie teased as they entered what had once been Lady Cordelia's private sitting room and was now Stephanie's office for managing the expanded Café Luna network. "I was an idiot," Matthew admitted readily. I thought you'd be intimidated by the money. Instead, you've taught me what to do with it." Café Luna had grown from a single neighborhood spot to 5 locations throughout the city, each one embedded in its community and designed to serve as both gathering place and economic catalyst. Stephanie had kept the original location as her flagship, but the new venues employed dozens of people and had sparked revitalization in previously neglected neighborhoods. The scholarship ceremony was held on the estate's back lawn, where fairy lights now hung year-round between ancient oak trees. Stephanie watched Matthew present awards to young people whose backgrounds reminded her of her own, and felt her heart swell with pride, not just for what he was giving them, but for who he'd become in the process. "Miss Stephanie!" a familiar voice called out after the formal presentations ended. Rosa, her first employee who now managed the original cafe, hurried over with a knowing smile. "You need to see the setup in the rose garden." "What setup?" Stephanie asked. But Rosa was already pulling her away from the reception, Matthew conspicuously absent from the crowd. The rose garden had been Cordelia's pride and joy. Hundreds of perfectly manicured plants arranged in precise geometric patterns. Under Stephanie's influence, it had been transformed into a community garden where neighborhood families grew vegetables and children learned about sustainable agriculture. But tonight, the utilitarian space had been transformed yet again. Thousands of tiny lights draped between the fruit trees, creating a canopy of stars above paths lined with luminarias. The community garden's raised beds had been decorated with flowers, and a small platform had been constructed where the old fountain used to be. Matthew stood in the center of it all, his formal tuxedo replaced by the simple dark jeans and sweater she remembered from their first days together. He was holding his cane in one hand and a small velvet box in the other, his storm-grey eyes bright with nervous hope. "Stephanie," he said as she approached, his voice carrying the same gentle sincerity that had first captured her heart. "6 months ago, I thought I'd lost you forever because I'd been too much of a coward to tell you the truth about who I was. But the truth is, I never knew who I was until I met you." Stephanie felt tears starting, the good kind this time, the kind that came from joy too big to contain. "You taught me that love isn't about what you can buy, or what title you carry, or which family you were born into," Matthew continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Love is about choosing to see someone's true heart and deciding that's exactly where you want to build your life." He knelt carefully, mindful of his injured leg but graceful in his determination. "Stephanie Catley, you saved my life in every way a person can be saved. You gave me courage, purpose, and a reason to believe that I could be worthy of the love you offered me. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that your faith in me wasn't misplaced?" The ring was beautiful, a vintage Art Deco design with a center diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the fairy lights like captured starlight. But what took Stephanie's breath away wasn't the jewelry. It was the sight of this powerful, wealthy, extraordinary man kneeling in the dirt of a community garden, asking her to share not just his name, but his mission to make their small part of the world better. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, of course, yes." The applause that erupted around them revealed that their supposedly private moment had attracted an audience. The scholarship recipients, the foundation staff, the neighbors who had become friends, all celebrating the love story that had transformed their community. Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, then pulled her down for a kiss that tasted like promise and forever. When they finally broke apart, Stephanie could see their entire future stretching out before them, not perfect, never perfect, but real and honest, and built on the foundation of choosing each other every single day. "So," she said, helping him to his feet, "where do we go from here, Lord Ryan?" "Actually," Matthew said with a grin that reminded her of the man who used to forget his wallet at her cafe counter. "I was thinking we could start with coffee. Black, no sugar, at a little place I know in the Arts District." Stephanie laughed, the sound carrying across the garden and mixing with the music and conversation of their impromptu engagement party. "I think I know the place. Fair warning, though, the owner has a tendency to fall for mysterious customers." "Perfect," Matthew said, pulling her close, "because this mysterious customer plans to keep coming back every day for the rest of his life." As they walked back toward the celebration, hand in hand, Stephanie realized that every painful moment of the past 6 months had been worth it to reach this perfect evening. They'd fought for their love against impossible odds, and won not just each other, but the chance to use their story to lift others up. The fairy lights twinkled overhead like earthbound stars, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of laughter and music drifting from the estate that had become a symbol of hope rather than exclusion.